Hi, my name is Matt Napier and welcome to Locked Up with a DiGiCo Part 2. In the first video, I showed you how I set up the SD1296 to do the song Breathe on the Roger Waters tour. This time we'll go into a little bit more detail in terms of gain structure and actually building a mix. We'll also take a brief look at spill sets and macros to increase your workflow. Last time when we set the console up, we had the instrumentation on the left-hand side bank. This is just my personal preference. And we had the vocals on the right-hand bank. What we're going to do now is we're going to try and get some control groups into action. Control groups are a really good way of grouping together instrumentation and allow you to have control on one fader. Now, last time on layer 1, I'd used up all my banks, so I could place my control groups onto layer 2, or I can use spill sets as a bit of a cheat to give me more of a surface to work on. So setting up spill sets is relatively straightforward. You go into layout, I'll get my mouse in the right place, layout, and then to set spill. Now you can see some set spills I've already built here. Earlier on, we set up multi-channels for my tom inputs and for my overheads. I've duplicated them here in set spills so I can assign them to a macro button. And I'll do the same here with control groups. So we're going to relabel this into control groups. And then we will assign the control groups to that spill set. So to get us started, we'll just do 5 or 6. There you go, 6. And then we'll assign that to a macro button on the actual desk surface. And it actually says spill VCA, and that's ready to go. So now when you look back at the console surface, over here where the macros are, in my second bank of macros, spill VCA, and that pulls up my control groups there. So I've got 6 control groups on my right-hand bank, and with the push of a button, I can get rid of them and go back to my inputs, or I can go to my control groups. Now I need to assign things to these control groups. So the easiest way to do that, I find, is join control group. So you do the LCD function, select join control group, and now control group 1, I can assign my drums to. So you assign your drums to the control group, and that way this now has complete control of the volume of the faders of the inputs assigned to that control group. The other advantage with a DiGiCo is it can also, you can use your control groups to control it on a mix. So if I select a mix, so this is a rough mix for someone. If I then go to my control groups, I can use this to control, this just has the drums assigned to it. So I can turn the drums down, or I can turn the drums up. So it's a very quick way of controlling a whole group of things. Now, the main advantage of that would obviously be in a scenario where you have, say, a backing singer might turn around to you and say, turn everything else down apart from myself. So if you have a control group with everything in other than vocals, that's a very easy way to turn it down. Rather than going through and changing 70 faders, you can grab one control group and turn it down. So that's control group setup. Control group setup, you saw how I assigned it to a macro. We did have some other macros in play there as well. If I show you some of the other macros I commonly use. Save current session, that's quite an easy macro to set up. Basically, you can have a macro so as soon as you hit the one macro button, it saves your current session. So I should probably do that now. There you go, I've just fired that and saved the session. The next macros I have in here are my talkbacks. What I tend to do is I actually set my solo bus up off the matrix, which I can show you here. So the solo bus, I route into the matrix, and then from the matrix, that then routes out and goes to my in-ear transmitter. And then I have a mono group labeled talks. And the advantage with this is I can then have a macro, which if I fire the macro, you should be able to see what it does if I find some inputs. So my talkback mics are on my left-hand bank. There you go. And what I have is I have 2 macros. So basically, put it up here so you can see. So for the sound check, the talkbacks are routed to the master bus, which is the main artist, and they will also be sending on the auxiliaries to every musician in the band. When I go to show mode, so if I fire the macro for show, what happens here is it unroutes it from the master bus, and on the auxiliaries, it turns the sends off. The idea being then, during the show, musicians can speak to me, they can speak to their techs, but anything they say won't be heard by the rest of the band or by the main artist. And consequently, in sound checks, everybody can hear what everyone is saying. And the advantage there is obviously in sound checks and rehearsals, people want to hear what they're saying. During the show, if a keyboard player is talking to his tech or talking to me, he doesn't want the rest of the band necessarily to hear what he's saying and to distract them. So with this one simple macro, I can change the routing to make sure that only the people who need to hear what's being said can hear what's being said. Other macros you can use is I've got one here for muting all my speakers on stage and one for opening up the speakers. And the other thing you can do with this is actually, if you set them onto the same button, you can see it here, it actually changes color when I fire it. So for when it's live speakers, which is during show mode, the macro goes green. And when I mute the speakers, it goes red. The reason I have that macro is pre-show, I will have all the in-ears on and all the inputs open, but all the speakers muted, obviously, so the audience don't hear it. And then the downbeat of the first song, I can turn on the side fills and any other wedges on stage. So that's a short little introduction to macros. They're really useful. They're very specific on the show, depending on what show you're doing, will depend on what macros you put into play. The same for spill sets. Spill sets can be used to group together a very small number of channels, which can be really useful if you have a song, say, where you might have the lead singer with an acoustic guitar doing a little acoustic section. So you could have a spill set that just pulls up the acoustic guitar, the vocal, and the reverb returns. So rather than jumping through layers trying to find those three sets of inputs, you can have them all appear on one bank together. So spill sets are a really good way of increasing your workflow. But now you've actually got your desk set up and you need to start getting ready to build a mix. As a monitor engineer, the first thing I do before I get to rehearsals is I actually pre-build mixes for the band members. So you'd actually go into your layers for your musicians and you would get some fader values on the desk. So day one in rehearsals, when everyone comes in, there's a rough mix there with everyone to get started with. And this is really, really important. I think too many times monitor engineers turn up in rehearsals or at a gig and the desk is basically a blank desk and they haven't pre-dialed it. It's really important in my mind to have a rough mix there. So when musicians start playing, there's a rough mix and they can start work. And as they work on their arrangements and on their playing, you can actually start working on building the mix and getting it together. And that's where multi-tracking comes in really useful, because you can multi-track quite easily into a DAW. And when the band are on a break or when the band are finished that day, you can sit there with the multi-track and you can tighten your mix up and improve your mix. But your mix is nothing if you don't get your gain structure right. So when the inputs first come into the console, the very first stage they hit will be the gain structure. So if I just show you very briefly on here. Now, obviously, on this desk, I'm using MADI inputs, so you're not really seeing many gains. But if I quickly assign this to a local input, you'll see how it should look. So local input, and there you go. That's your DiGiCo channel strip. So the first thing that comes in when it hits it is the gain. And this is the most important control on the desk. This is where you set it up. And it's crucial that you understand a little bit about how gain works. So you can see here on this slide, this is on the left-hand side, you have a digital system with dBFS, which is dB full scale. And 0 is the theoretical maximum that you can have in the system. If you go beyond 0, there you will get digital clipping. Compared to old analog systems, analog plus 24 dBu. Now with analog, you can see just where the red line starts. +4 was the nominal operating level at 0 VU. And this was always, with analog, a good aim of where to get your inputs coming into your mixing console. And you can see there with digital systems, it relates to about -20. Now, there is no standard for digital systems about where this nominal level is. And it does vary between sort of -15, -18, -20, -22, depending on the digital system. With the DiGiCo in the options for meters, you can actually change where you want this alignment level to be. Obviously, if you're looking at the meter ballistics in terms of digital, all you'll see is this scale here from 0 all the way down to basically infinity. It says 60 on the desk, but obviously 119 is the noise floor. What you're trying to do with your gain structure is allow enough of the input into the system to basically have the input bouncing around this middle section where that red line is. Now, depending on the metering, it can look slightly different. So if we look at a different slide here, this shows you the difference in different metering systems. So on the right-hand side there, you've got your digital with 0 dBFS as the maximum at the top, and where that relates to with the other slides. Now, personally, I quite like the Nordic scale of metering. It's logarithmic, so it gives you a bit more detail around the center section. And where it says test, that's kind of relates to, depending on the option you select in the DiGiCo options, you can either select it for -18 or -20. And it's often a good idea if you're using a playback system as part of your band to sit with the playback operator and make sure that you're both on the same digital gaining structure. So you kind of got to agree, okay, you're using Pro Tools, we're going to use -18 as our nominal output level. And that way you can see a signal coming in from Pro Tools digitally into your desk. You can then make sure it lines up at -18 dBFS or at the test signal if you're using the Nordic level. And that way your gain structure is the right amount coming into the desk. So once you've got your gain dialed in on an input, and actually if you look at I've got the track playing here. If you look at where my inputs are coming into on here, obviously these are post gain because I've already recorded them. But you can see that you don't want the inputs to be coming in too hot, because if they come in too hot, by the time you sum them, you run out of headroom, which is why if you're coming in at -18, -20, it gives you a bit of headroom for the summation. So by the time you get to the output stages, you're not peaking the output. So you can see here on my output here for this mix here, that's hitting a nice output, a nice averaging. The peaks are hitting -10, the average is about -20. And that's kind of where you want your mix to be. It's also important that you make sure you align your inputs and your outputs. So if you're using radio microphones, you've got to make sure they line up with what's coming in with the desk. And if you're going into a digital in-ear, in-ear transmission system, that the settings you have on the in-ears relate to what you've got on the desk. So a good way sometimes is to run tone through your whole signal path and make sure at each stage you're not adding or boosting too much gain. And then that way, as the engineer, your meters on the desk are realistic of what's going on both in terms of your inputs and your outputs. So for example, my in-ears, I will always align very carefully to make sure that my in-ear outputs are, if it's showing -20 on the output of the desk, I'm hitting approximately -20 on the in-ear transmitter. And most gear has an option where you can kind of tweak it, and you can tweak the input or the output gain to make it match. So then you actually get down to actually sort of listening to the sound and starting to EQ it. So after you've done your input gain, you have your digital trim. I tend to leave my gain out of snapshots and scenes because I think that should be done according to the source material. So the guitar player plays his guitar, make sure the mic's in the right place, make sure you have the correct microphone. Then I bring the gain up to make sure the gain's hitting about -18 on the input to the desk. And then after that is the digital trim. Now I may use the trim to tweak as a creative tool, and I might have that included in snapshots, but the gain I normally leave out of snapshots, and that's just a personal preference. So once you come through the gain, you then hit your high and low pass filters. Now, this is one of the biggest tools in terms of shaping the sound. If we go to the keyboard inputs on this song, and if I just solo up, say, the Leslie High, so you can hear the Leslie here. Now, that's with the high pass filter out, and you can hear a bit of low end rumbling there, depending on what you're listening to. And if I put the high pass filter in, that cleans up a lot of the low end. Now, I've currently got that set at 360 hertz. If you listen to the Leslie low microphone, the opposite's true there, where if I take the low pass filter out, I can hear too much of the top. So if I punch the low pass filter in, that cleans up the bottom end. And then when I sum the two together, it sounds like a Leslie cabinet. So that's quite a good example of how to use your high and low pass filters to clean up your mix. It's really important when you're building the mix that you get rid of unwanted noise from inputs. You don't want to be too extreme. Overheads are a good example. You might, depending on the type of music you're doing, you might get rid of all the low end out of your overheads and make it just so it's just the cymbals, and then you can place that on top of your kick, your snare, and your hat. And that works really well if you're after a sort of rocky sound. If you're after a more jazzy sound, you might actually leave the overheads more full range, and then that's the basis of your drum mix, and then you just add in a bit of kick, snare, and hat to supplement. So it depends from which angle of attack you're approaching it. But the high and low pass filters are crucial to get rid of the unwanted noise, particularly the lows and the highs. Obviously, that's what they do. But that really helps you when you're touring and when you're going from venue to venue, because one of the biggest challenges, particularly with in-ear monitoring nowadays, is you have multiple mixes and snapshots set up for a show, but then you're moving to different acoustic environments every day. And if you can filter out the unwanted noise, that also gets rid of a lot of the nasty room noise that can spill into the microphones. And that way, when you go from one venue to the next, your mix isn't changing radically. The musicians have consistency, everyone knows where they stand, and it makes for a successful tour. So high and low pass filters, absolutely crucial. Once you've then got your sounds EQ'd, and to be fair, I mean, you can see, if I show you on this screen here, I'm not a huge fan of EQ. I think it's, you can see that I'm a little bit on the kick drum, you know, again, high and low pass filters on most things, the odd little dips here and there. I think it's really important to try and allow the musicians to hear what they're playing and the actual tone of their instruments. They spend a long time getting the tone they want. What we're just doing, I think, is just shaping that sound to make it work in their own ears. I don't think it's necessarily my job as a monitor engineer to reinvent the wheel and make it sound completely different. Obviously, with pop music, sometimes you have to do that. That's part of the job. But more often than not, if there's a problem with the sound, it's best to go back to the source. If the guitar doesn't sound right, you know, maybe change the microphone. Maybe the guitar player needs to change the cab for that song. It's a process where you work together and you try and get the sound that the artist and the musician wants. But ultimately, if they've already chosen that guitar combo with that guitar pedal, with that guitar, then that's the sound they want you to recreate. So again, really useful tip is go on stage, take your in-ears out, listen to the guitar cab, and then go back and use your EQ to make it sound as close as possible to how it sounds without the in-ears. And that's something that not too many people do, but I think it's a really worthwhile tip to go on stage and actually walk around the stage and talk to the musicians and listen to the instrumentation and try and recreate that for them in their in-ears, because ultimately that's what you're doing. You're a monitor engineer. They want to monitor what they're playing. So once you've got your sounds EQ'd, your next stage is your dynamics. Now, there's a big move at the moment to use lots of plugins and have huge plugin chains. But ultimately, I don't really believe in that. I think if you've got good instrumentation, you've got good musicians, why would you change what they're doing too drastically? Now, there's obviously a time and a place for certain elements of compression and gating and everything else. But to try and fundamentally change the source material, I think it's not really our place as sound engineers to do that. Now, that'll open up a question of debate amongst some people, because people do like their plugins. They like to have these massive plugin chains. But 9 times out of 10, I think it just colors the mix. You add in a lot of phase shifting and you muddy it up and you create a worse sound. So personally, I keep things quite simple and then try and balance them in the mix as best I can. So you've got your instruments done, you've got them EQ'd, you've got your gain structure done, and now you try and bring them into the mix a little bit. So we can just, I have to take the mute off. So there you go, you've got your mix coming in, and now you can try and sit that Leslie in the mix. And you find the right spot for it, you can bring it up, you can bring it down. Obviously I'm mixing on Apple EarPods, so it's not going to be the best mix. But that's how you can basically listen each individual instrument, tweak the EQ, get your gain structure right, bring your faders up, get the mix balanced. Hopefully, it all sits together quite nicely. You communicate with the musicians, you balance your mix, and you keep progressing forwards. And that's all it's about. It's about using your ears, not using the screens, not using the meter bridges too much, but using your ears to get the mix right. The meter bridges are crucial at the gain staging, but at the mix stage, you mix on the faders. So it's one of those things where get gain staging right, your faders should be up around 0, everything should be sitting in a rough mix. And then, because the faders are logarithmic, that's why you want to be running, your faders want to be running between +5 and -5. You shouldn't be pushing faders up to +20 and all the way down here. What you don't want to see is a mix where your faders are like this all over the place, because then your gain structure is wrong. If you've got your gain structure right, your faders will be hovering around the 0 mark. Now, obviously, guitar solos come up, you give them a push, you pull them down. That's what the faders are for. Don't be frightened to use them. You don't need to have them lined up like a ruler, but at the same time, you don't want your faders all over the place like that. Anyway, hopefully that's been of some interest to some people. I will do another video where we'll go into snapshots and timecode. And we've got timecode running on this console at the moment from the show. So we'll be able to build a few snapshots and incorporate them together. Thank you very much for watching.